welcome to the CSDS Political Ecology in Asia seminar series. Today is the first dialogue series that we're beginning, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Danny Marks to our session today. So first, let me introduce Danny Marks. Dr. Danny Marks is currently an assistant professor of environmental politics and policy in the School of Law and Government of Dublin City University. Prior to this position, he was an assistant professor of environmental studies at the Department of Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong. He completed his PhD dissertation at the University of Sydney titled An Urban Political Ecology of the 2011 Bangkok Floods. Overall, Dr. Marks focuses on environmental governance in Southeast Asia, and in particular looks at the political ecology, environmental justice, climate governance, and disaster risk reduction. He has addressed a wide range of crucial and interconnected environmental issues, some of which we'll be discussing today during this dialogue, including on flooding and disaster in Bangkok, its governance, and the uneven vulnerabilities that it generated, as well as the issue of disaster justice. He also has researched on climate change, impacts and adaptation, including the implications for urban governance, and then more recently on traffic congestion and urban haze in Bangkok, marine plastic pollution originating from Thailand, and lastly, environmental justice in relation to hydropower dams in Laos that connect to shopping malls in Bangkok. So before we begin, I'll just very briefly introduce the Political Ecology in Asia Dialogue series that we're beginning. So this is a new initiative of the Centre for Social Development Studies, and we're organising it to try and encourage rigorous debate through the lens of political ecology on development issues and trends in Asia. And we want to emphasise the social and environmental and economic changes that are taking place, as well as questions of social and environmental inequalities and justice. We aim to both emphasise the deeply embedded challenges that occur in the region, but also on the possibilities for transformative ways forward. We also hope that this dialogue series will encourage new angles on thinking about development and new thinking on political ecology in Asia. We also hope that it will stimulate discussion among researchers, civil society, public intellectual, and others. So with that introduction, I'd like again to welcome Danny to our session today. Well, maybe we should begin with the area of work that you've most focused on over the past years, which is on flooding and uneven vulnerability in Bangkok. So maybe we could just begin with a relatively straightforward question, apparently, which is, could you outline your analysis of the political ecology of disastrous flooding in Bangkok? In particular, what are the underlying reasons that you think Bangkok is vulnerable to flooding, and especially to disastrous flooding? What are the key impacts, and how does it help to explain who is vulnerable to flooding?
Okay, sure. First, thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be the first speaker in this new series. So to answer the question about why is Bangkok acutely vulnerable to floods, so most of my research looked at the 2011 floods in Bangkok, which killed about 800 people in central Thailand and led to $45 billion in damage, and it's the worst disaster in many, many years. So one major reason why Bangkok is vulnerable to flooding is the way the city developed. So Michael Douglas uses this term incubation period, which is the idea that these factors accumulate and interact with each other to compound vulnerability. So it's the idea that disasters are not natural. I mean, instead they're actually due to political economic factors. They're historical productions over time. And so if you look all the way to the history of Bangkok, originally you could say Bangkok had a very high resilience to flooding. It was seen as the Venice of the East. It had canals, people lived on boathouses. The areas around Bangkok were rice fields and rice paddies, and so they could absorb the excess floodwater, and of course the canals could too. And this changed in the 1890s, and then the roads replaced canals and houses replaced boathouses, and especially after World War II, Bangkok urbanized rapidly. But the problem was that it urbanized in a quite haphazard fashion. There was a lack of urban planning. There was very mixed land use, for example, If you look at a map of urbanization, our land use change was very haphazard. It was under three ribbons, like the north, west, and the east. And so this led to a higher vulnerability to flooding. So for example, there was rapid land use change. I think, for example, statistics shows from 1974 to 2003, the built-up area, the concretized area, expanded by 4 times. And so, I mean, this is very bad for flooding because these surfaces are impervious. Water has a very low infiltration rate, and so this hastens runoff into channels. So that's one thing. I mean, this land use change. Another thing was a lot of these canals were replaced. So for example, a lot of roads or sois in Bangkok, the small sois, were paved over canals. Another thing has been groundwater pumping. Bangkok is sunk by a meter since the 1970s. This is bad, also bad for plumbing. It reduces the height of the flood walls, but also makes it longer to drain the water outside of Bangkok. So one major issue is there's a lack of green space in Bangkok. I mean, Bangkok, the statistics shows I think it's about 3 square meters per person, which is the lowest in all major Asian cities. I think Singapore is 66. The green index of Asia is about 39. So without this green space, there's very little space for the water to go. So this makes Bangkok vulnerable. I mean, the other thing was there's a concentration of people and assets. So I mean, the Thai government basically prioritized Bangkok-led growth. It invested in the seaport and universities and airport, and there was a regressive rice tax at the time. So this pushed all the people to come to Bangkok. And so, I mean, Bangkok changed from an agriculture to industrial led economy during this time, and Bangkok was the epicenter of this. And so this led to rapid industrial development, but then also housing estates. And so as you can just imagine, Bangkok was this small circle and it just expanded. And so the government tried to think about flooding and flood protection. So for example, in the western parts of the city, for example, not close to Suvarnabhumi Airport, they designated this eastern floodway channel, a green belt basically. And so there was supposed to be very limited development in this area. But a study in 2013 found that there was, I think, 28,000 houses in that area. And so this is a good demonstration of the poor land use control. And so urban planning was quite weak. There's many different reasons. One was there's 5-year plans. There was a gap between those plans, and so they built during that time. The other part was fines are very low. There wasn't, and even I think only recently was there actually any control, and even now it's quite weak. But I mean, the plan sometimes followed land use. So you built, and then the land use reflected that. So this poor city planning was a major factor. And then I guess this begs the question, though, from a political ecology angle, why was city planning so weak? Why did the state not prioritize flood control or green space or environmental issues? And I think there's a number of reasons. One is the political elite profited greatly from this urbanization, from this rapid urbanization. They profited from industrialization and real estate development. And so especially in the 1970s, when there was the rise of local political elite, they pushed back against any control, any land use control, any flood controls. But also even the middle class, they wanted deregulation. And so this led to a rapid real estate boom. But at the same time, also, I mean, Thailand's had a number of military leaders. And so to gain legitimacy, they realized they need economic growth. And so they didn't want to pull back either. I mean, they didn't want to. And so basically, those who profited were the ones who pushed back against any land use control or thinking about long-term flood protection.
Maybe just to expand a bit further on this, we focused on the vulnerability within Bangkok city itself, but then the flooding takes place within the context of the wider Chao Phraya basin.
Oh, yes.
And I know that you've also written on this, that some of the changes that took place in the wider Chao Phraya basin have also created vulnerability to flooding both within the wider basin, but also within Bangkok. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the wider changes within the basin.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I mean, so the Chapter River Basin is now highly built up. There's a lot of irrigation channels. But the problem was the whole thing was built for irrigation, it was not built for flooding. So for example, I mean, the funnel, like the way canals are built, they're built for irrigation rather than the other way around. And so this worsened flood vulnerability. But another problem where this was a major issue in 2011 were dams. I mean, there's these huge Bhumibol and Sirikit dams, also the Chhapriya Dam. And so they serve multiple purposes. I mean, one is hydropower development, the other was irrigation, and the third was flood protection. But the problem was in 2011, for example, they prioritized the other two, especially irrigation. And so this meant that the dams were about to break. And so when there was flooding downstream, the flood managers were basically forced to release water. All this farmland meant, I mean, what happened was in 2011 was that normally, for example, political leaders, particularly bureaucrats, prioritized protecting urban areas. But in 2011, because there was so much farmland upstream and the Pheu Thai government, which was led by Yingluck at the time, prioritized giving farmers enough time to grow the second crop of rice. And so instead of flooding farmland upstream, which they'd done in the past, now they've protected farmers. And so this backfired. And so this showed that decisions made upstream actually led to more flooding downstream. And so that shows that these changes to the Chhapriya Basin compounded vulnerability. There's also politics, of course, of upstream versus downstream.
Right, thank you. I wondered, so political ecology often looks at who is particularly at risk or who's vulnerable. So when we talk about the flooding that happens in Bangkok and the wider basin, are there particular groups of people that are vulnerable and why?
Okay, so if you go back to 2011, a statistic by UN SCAP, which was not published, found that within Bangkok, 73% of low-income communities were affected by the flooding, which is much higher than overall Bangkok. Like, for example, right here, hardly anyone was affected. Of course, Bangkok, as you know, is mixed in terms of slums or low-income communities are mixed within higher income and real estate developments. But what happened, particularly in the 80s and 90s, was the land prices rose around here. They evicted a lot of these low-income communities who didn't have any land rights. And so low-income communities basically suburbanized to north and northeast. So this was the areas that were the most badly flooded within Bangkok because they protected the inner city. But they're also more vulnerable for a number of reasons. First of all, studies showed that their housing is the lowest. So for example, a common practice by real estate developers is to fill in the land with sand and to raise this. But this will push water down to low-income communities, but they're also along canals because that's the only strip of land which is free, which is where they can reside. And the problem is Bangkok has a severe shortage of good public housing. And so the slum solution has just always been a temporary solution. And so because they live along the canals and the canals are overflow, their houses are affected. Their houses are also less resistant. They also have less savings. A lot of them lost jobs because the factories were where they worked, which are on the outskirts of Thailand, when you say Bangkok, they closed down. And so they suffered the most. And so, for example, the research I did was that they suffered losses of 3 to 4 months of the amount of compensation they got from the government, their losses. So it affected them primarily. So what was interesting, though, actually, from a political ecology angle, is so within the scale of so political ecology predicts. I mean, like a lot of people have written that when decisions are going to be made, the elite are going to protect themselves and their constituents, and so that's what you saw within the scale of Bangkok. That the inner city right here, this is the central business district, the government offices. So they built flood walls all around the outskirts of Bangkok, and so they protected themselves. But on the scale of the Chhapriya Basin, this is what one of my articles talks about, was actually the opposite. It was actually against what you predict. So farmers are actually, a lot of them smallholder farmers, they weren't flooded as badly as, say, the industrial estates in Ayutthaya. And so this shows how, from a geographical perspective, for example, I was talking about upstream versus downstream, but also politics of the moment with the rice pledging scheme. And so it's a number of factors which actually shows that these predictions aren't always correct.
And you've also written about the concept of disaster justice. So in the context of the flooding and the impacts and the uneven impacts between different groups, what does that mean for your idea of disaster justice?
Okay, so for the article I wrote on disaster justice, we actually found that there was kind of two contested notions of flood justice. And these were developed because of Thai's political and cultural history. And so one was this more hierarchical, traditional notion of justice that, for example, Bangkok itself is like the mandala of power, but the inner city of Bangkok, especially where the palace, the government agencies, as I talked about, that is also, the space of power are the space that should be prioritized. And so if you look at distribution, so to go back to the idea of environmental justice, David Schlossberg talks about three types of justice. One would be distribution. How do you distribute floodwater? Does one part of this room get it? Is it equal? One is procedure. Does everyone get a say in where floodwater goes? And the last would be recognition. Is everyone recognized equally? So to go back to this traditional notion of justice, for them, distribution would be outer areas of Bangkok should be sacrificed, or the outer provinces outside Bangkok, because you need to protect the inner city of the space. For procedures, they're the elites. They're the ones who they know best. They make decisions which are best for the country. And then for terms of recognition is, once again, their decisions are worth more. But this was contested by more egalitarian. This goes back to, red shirt protest long before that as well. And this is this idea of that everyone should be flooded equally. All spaces should be flooded equally. The inner city should, like for example, knee level instead of some parts completely dry and other parts head high. And decisions should also be made in terms of public participation democratically, and then everyone should also be recognized equally. And so the state primarily prescribed to this traditional notion of justice, the hierarchical. But there was a lot of contestations. This egalitarian notion of justice was promoted by a lot of local communities. And so I went out to these communities and talked to them. And a lot of them thought it was completely unfair that they're flooded head high and it was dry here. And they said, we're the small people. Those big people are making decisions. And so they protested. There was 85 protests in the Bangkok metropolitan region. One of them, for example, had the slogan, "We are quality citizens of Bangkok too." And they tried to negotiate with the government to lower flood walls. Sometimes they would break down the water gates because there was a 2-meter difference between the water gates. And so they tried to claim basically an equal right to the city and promote this more egalitarian notion of justice.
Great, thank you very much. So having discussed about disaster justice, the question maybe is, how does your explanation differ from the official explanation of the Thai government that was kind of managing the response to the flooding in a sense?
Okay, sure. So I think the discourses or the narratives that the Thai government proposed wanted to absolve themselves of responsibility for the floods. So what they said, for example, ex-Prime Minister Yingluck said is, seems like we're fighting the forces of nature. Our ex-Deputy Prime Minister Kitirat Nanarong said, flooding is a result of climate change and global warming. So basically they're saying it's not our fault. There was too much water, we did the best we can. But the problem with this explanation is there actually wasn't that much water. Scientists found that the amount of rain that fell in the catchment area was not that unusual. For example, of the 10 largest flood events from 1985 to 2012, 2011 was only number 5 in terms of magnitude and 9th in terms of area affected. So these meteorologists found that maybe at most this was a 1 to 20, 1 to 30 year return period in terms of the flood, in terms of how bad it was, which was different than the World Bank and JICA was saying. So my question is, why was there so much damage? Was there because too much water? So as I talked about already, urbanization was part of it. Also, it's because of these decisions that were made in 2011, these poor decisions in terms of dams, in terms of water gates, the whole infrastructure was managed. But also, it's because of these flood walls that blocked the water from coming into the inner city, so these outer areas suffered greatly. So this worsened the vulnerability of those outside Bangkok. Another issue, there was a lack of early warning. The national government kept on saying "Ao Yu," which means we can handle it. So people I talked to said they did not move their goods, for example, upstairs, or did not evacuate as early as they would have if they got a good warning. So yes, there was a lot of water, but it was due to poor urban planning, poor governance, and political interference. But this is also, so for example, I talked about these protesters in Don Mueang. So they actually tried to sue the government, saying that you mismanaged the floods. It's your fault that we got badly flooded. But unfortunately, the judiciary ruled on the side of the government, saying that it was natural. So they didn't get any compensation.
So maybe that leads to another important question, which is, could disastrous flooding happen again? I mean, I know from the longer-term history of the Chao Phraya Basin in Bangkok that large floods periodically do strike the city, but the 2011 flood has been discussed so much, and it leads to this kind of question: well, have lessons been learned? Have things changed? What will the future look like? Could another disastrous flood happen, and would it be the same as the 2011 event, or have things changed enough that the impacts might be less, or the opposite, perhaps?
It's a very good question. I think about, in terms of lessons learned and making predictions for the future, I think you have to go back to 2011 and think about what was the response. What did they do in response to the floods? And so this goes again back to what do they think were the causes? And like I said, they didn't blame it on poor management, but there has been some small improvements to management. There's a lot of government fragmentation, and that's improved a bit. That still exists. But there hasn't been many changes, for example, to land use planning. But the major thing that they've done, or project they've done, is because they blamed it on too much water, is they sought to basically protect Bangkok even more. So one major project that the Yingluck government did before the military government took place is build raise a series of roads around Bangkok. Basically the height of the 2011 floods, plus 2 meters higher. So these roads are very high. I went out and inspected them. And so these are out, for example, in the Kon Patom, around the Tachin River. And so some people's houses, they are lower than the roads. So if you had the same floods that happened again, so water would come from the Chao Phraya Basin, but if these roads were not breached, then there would be new groups of vulnerability. These would be smallholder farmers, for example, on the outskirts of Bangkok metropolitan region, or groups in Ayutthaya. So for also the industrial estates were badly flooded. They raised the walls around them very highly, and they also sued the government, but they lost that suit. So there'll be new patterns of vulnerability, but it would still be very unequal, for example, in terms of income groups who would be affected. But another major issue is that you've seen that flash flooding is still a major risk in Bangkok. If Bangkok received a lot of heavy precipitation over a number of days, particularly if they were not prepared. This was during the dry season, which you can see with climate change. That because of this lack of green space, where's the water going to go? And so you see that. I mean, cars already get affected when there's just episodes of flash flooding. A more long-term issue, for example, would be coastal flooding. You have coastal erosion in Bang Khon Thien, which is the only district in Bangkok which is along the Chao Phraya Gulf, but also in Samut Prakan, which is the metropolitan region. I mean, you've already seen 1 kilometer of coastal erosion in that area. And so, I mean, in terms of long-term issues, this is certainly a major issue in terms of coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and land subsidence.
So I think, just thinking to what was reported in the Bangkok Post, maybe a couple of years ago, there were articles that Bangkok could be underwater within 30 years, and it was in the context of the discussions on the Paris Agreement and its implementation. So I know that you've also written on climate change and urban governance. So maybe just a slightly broader question on what could be the consequences for climate change, of climate change on a city like Bangkok? And especially viewed through a political ecology and disaster justice lens, what would be some of the consequences?
Okay, I mean, that's a good... So, I mean, one major issue which is already occurring is this coastal erosion. And so this, I mean, you can say it's sea level rise, I mean, due to climate change. So far, from what I've found out, I mean, sea level rise is actually quite a small contributor to it. Though, as sea level rises, it will certainly affect more and more. But I mean, a lot of it's actually due to mangrove deforestation. It's due to actually the dams holding back sediment downstream. It's due to this pumping of groundwater in the past, which was particularly by industries. And so these, for example, aquaculture farmers and fishers who live on the coast of Bangkok and the Bangkok metropolitan region, they've already had to move their houses a number of times. Some of them have to leave the area because the cost became too high. And so this can be almost a prediction for the future, that as this worsens, these marginalized groups will be worse affected. But then also flooding, as we talked about, could be more an issue if you have flash flooding. Once again, low-income groups. Heat can also be another issue. As the temperatures rise, the chances of heat waves affecting this city will rise. And even drought. You look at Cape Town, where they almost ran out of water. There's been a couple incidents here where the tap water has become salty, and there's fears that the tap water might run dry. It hasn't happened yet. But these are all things that could. These are all environmental risks that could accelerate as climate change worsens. And through a lens of urban governance, unfortunately, BMA, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, hasn't done much so far. They focus mostly on flood protection. But in terms of, for example, building parks and more green space, there's only been small improvements. In terms of land subsidence, coastal erosion, they've been slow on this. But part of this is also because Bangkok Metropolitan Administration is actually quite weak. They don't have much power. And so this is through the wider lens of urban governance in Bangkok and the lack of decentralization, where the national government has pushed back to completely decentralizing power to municipalities, including Bangkok. And so it makes it more difficult, to be fair to BMA, to be able to do much.
So then this probably leads to a kind of concluding question on the issue of flooding and its intersection with climate change, which is, if you were to make some policy recommendations or to identify some priority actions, and especially with the viewpoint of achieving climate justice or disaster justice, what sorts of directions and policies would you be recommending?
Well, that's a good question. So I think from the wider city perspective, I think trying to make the city more of a sponge city, which China has done. And so, for example, like the Centennial Park here at Chula, which is not far, is the idea of using green infrastructure, these nature-based solutions. And so this would have, for example, the Department of Public Parks and BMA working together with the Department of Public Works, which they unfortunately don't do. And so together they could think about making parks, not just only aesthetically pleasing, but actually having a function of storing stormwater. From a disaster justice perspective, climate justice, you need better public housing. Cody, for example, has done Ban Mongkong, but unfortunately that's very small. So you need that on a much wider scale to solve the issues of low-income communities. But also, you need better social protection. You need to incorporate the voice of the poor within policy making, make it more inclusive, but also a higher minimum wage. Climate justice is tied to democracy. It's tied to poverty reduction. It's like one of the slogans in the U.S. now is you can't have climate justice without racial justice. So in the context of Bangkok, you can't have climate justice without class justice, for example. But I also think that Bangkokians themselves need to do something. Because, for example, it's shown that the higher and upper class here actually produce a lot of emissions, particularly in terms of transport and energy. So there needs to be policies or ways for them to reduce their own emissions as well.
Well, this then leads us on to a second topic I was hoping we could discuss, which is the haze pollution that strikes the city every year, which I know that you've also been writing on, both academically but also in the Bangkok Post. So it seems that every year in the cool season, the air becomes unbreathable, similar to many other cities across Asia. I know that you've written recently on traffic pollution and then also haze in general. So I wonder if you could just explain a little bit, why does haze occur in Bangkok? But especially using a political ecology lens to really help us analyze it. What are the root causes of haze in the city?
Okay, sure. Haze is a serious issue here. I'm not sure if people realize it, but there's an estimated 18,000 deaths caused per year in Bangkok due to haze. And this is long term, so it's not immediate. I mean, 24,000 deaths in Thailand overall, about 3/4 are in Bangkok. It reduces life expectancy among all Thais about two years, including here in Bangkok. So unfortunately, I mean, it unfortunately hasn't gotten better. If you look at PM 2.5 levels, for example, they've remained high, particularly during the cool season. And so what I found out is there's basically three major contributors to haze in Bangkok. So what I recently written a paper with Michelle Miller of National University of Singapore, and we use the lens of transboundary political ecology because air blows, I mean, from many different directions. It can even come from other countries, but certainly can come from other provinces. So for Bangkok, the three major sources are transport, vehicular exhaust, vehicular emissions, industry, which is mostly around Bangkok, and the third one is agriculture. So basically, we argue that if you look at the underlying factors, so from like a political economy, a political ecology perspective, one thing is the administrative fragmentation, which I talked about, but the other has been prioritization of economic growth over environmental protection. And then finally is the protection of vested business and interests. So they've created a number of barriers. And so we actually use this idea of slow violence. So this is an idea by Rob Nixon, and basically this is violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, and it's dispersed across time and space. And it's not even viewed as violence at all, but actually the elites in Thailand are perpetrating this violence upon marginalized groups. And so, for example, if you look at who contributes the most or who profits the most from haze, in terms of vehicular emissions, the automobile companies, it's the middle and upper class drivers, car users, it's the industrial factory owners. I mean, you look at Mataput, for example, and major agribusiness companies as well, sugar cane and corn. And those groups which are most vulnerable are, for example, motorbike taxi drivers, street sweepers, roadside vendors, factory workers, and smallholder farmers. And so there's inequality also wrapped within this area of haze. And the problem is, I mean, if you just go back, for example, to transport, is that there's no policies to push people to drive less. And public transport, particularly the bus system, is inadequate, and the government has not done a good enough job to help, for example, the poor be able to access Bangkok, but also to push people. For example, there's too much free parking. It's relatively cheap to buy a car, and there's no, for example, congestion pricing, which you have in London and Singapore and other places. And so this just contributes to the problem at the scale of Bangkok. But then also sugarcane farming, for example, it's the agribusiness companies who profit the most, but they don't have to bear the cost. There's these externalities from the burning.
So you just emphasized that there's inequalities, or even I think you mean like injustices as well, related to the sources of haze, but also who's exposed. Mm-hmm. I guess there's one perception amongst a number of Bangkokians, at least, that we all breathe the same air. So in other words, like, haze is non-discriminatory, but I think it's really important that what you're emphasizing is that both who benefits from haze, but also who's most impacted from it, actually has a number of inequalities within it, or injustices, in fact. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on whether that's really recognized, if you think about the policy discussions, or if you think about even the public discussions that are taking place. Is the issue of inequality and injustices in haze really recognized, let alone being addressed?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's mostly from a technocratic perspective and not thinking about inequalities or injustice. I mean, for example, if you just look at street side vendors, so for example, vehicle exhaust is worst at roadside, and the farther you get away from the road, the less air you have. So for example, if you could just tell street side vendors to just move away from the roads, that would help them a little bit. But I mean, I think there's no recognition that also, for example, people who drive in cars, they have air conditioning, or a lot of people have air filters in their homes, especially the middle upper class. Well, for example, those below expressways, they receive the worst air as well from these cars. So, I mean, for example, smallholder farmers, I went out to Konkan recently, we measured PM 2.5 levels where there was burning, and it's off the charts. It's terrible, but I don't think people, instead they blame these farmers, instead of realizing that these farmers actually have very limited choice. I mean, they probably realize that it's not great for them, but I mean, they have limited land, they have a lot of pressure, often they're in debt, they're locked into these contract farming schemes, and so instead of talking about equitable land, most of the discourse is about blaming them, or finding ways to help them, like for example, giving them a harvesting machine, which is not very practical as they cost 15 million baht, which is beyond the budget of most of them. So I think there just needs to be more recognition, for example, in policies in terms of, for example, punishing or boycotting or fining those who are who are the main perpetrators of this issue, and also finding ways, for example, to help these groups which are most at risk.
So I think you've emphasised that it's the economic imperatives that are underpinning many of the reasons why Haze is generated. Mm-hmm. It makes me think back to early last year when Bangkok went into its first lockdown with COVID-19 response. Mm-hmm. And there was a brief period of relatively clean air that was linked to the fact that people were staying home. More recently, I think in the last episode of Haze, some government staff were suggested, why don't you work at home instead of coming into the office to keep traffic off the street? And I think that's partly reflecting the possibility of working from home due to the economic transformation. But overall, I think you're sort of pinpointing that the economic imperatives, or the economic growth imperatives, kind of trump the value of clean air, especially given the inequalities as to who's exposed and who benefits from it. So I wonder, is Haze here to stay in Bangkok, or do you see any conditions under which there could be cleaner air in the city, and what would it take for it to happen?
Okay, so first to go to your point about economic imperatives. So for example, people I interviewed, they talked about that policymakers, for example, our automobile companies, for example, would use the excuse of, like, for example, one thing that Thailand needs to do is way behind on its Euro standards, which are fuel efficiency standards. I mean, other countries have implemented these standards years ago, and Thailand was supposed to upgrade from Euro 4 to Euro 5. I mean, some countries are at Euro 6. But then they said, well, with COVID, you know, people don't have as much money to pay for automobiles are going to get more expensive, and so we're going to delay it for 3 more years. Or, for example, for burnt sugarcane farmers, they can't afford to use harvesting machines, so we're going to allow more burnt sugarcane. So these are basically almost excuses being used. Our industry factories as well, we need industrial growth, so industries don't need to crack down on their pollutants. But instead, it seems that these discourses are excuses. So what's needed? I mean, I think there needs to be higher public awareness. The word PM 2.5, for example, is quite new. I mean, it's great that there's more awareness of this issue. And this has pushed some small changes, small improvements. For example, you see Chiang Rai province, there was actually very little burning this year. Unfortunately, they still had to suffer the effects of the surrounding provinces. But I mean, there has been small improvements. But I think the one major step forward would be a new piece of legislation, the Thailand Clean Air Act. And there's actually many different versions of it. The Thai Chamber of Commerce has one version, but the version that I think would be the best is one promoted by civil society. For example, particularly the Thai Clean Air Network, Greenpeace as well. This garnered 40,000 signatures. And this would create almost a US-style EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which could crack down, give out fines, and also model the Singapore Transboundary Haze Act. So even fine Thai companies, for example, who cause haze in other countries, which blows over into Thailand, which is a major issue, for example, in Chiang Mai. And it would also create a platform for citizens to be watchdogs. I mean, this legislation in itself is not a silver bullet, but this would certainly be a way forward to address this issue.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah. So maybe just to conclude, we've touched on 2 of the key topics that you've researched on and you're active on, which are haze and flooding, but I know that you've also written on a range of other environmental issues, especially facing Thailand, including plastic pollution, electricity planning. So I wonder if you see any connections between your work. We focused on two issues, but more broadly, when you look at the political ecology of these environmental, societal issues, are there things that pull them together that you can comment on?
Sure. So one major issue which I try to discuss a lot in my research is this issue of inequality and injustice as well, in terms of who benefits and who is harmed by these environmental, often risks. And so, I mean, what I found out in Thailand that is often the vested interests, the elite, they suffer the least, but marginalized groups suffer the most, but they benefit the least. So there's a clear inequality in terms of that. But also I found that the Thai overall political system, which Pasuk Pongpai and Chris Baker called an oligarchy. So it's a high degree of inequality in terms of wealth and in terms of political power. And so this has prevented a lot of movement in terms of addressing these issues. And also there's very unequal privilege in terms of, for example, to legal and political structures. And so this has been a major impediment. But there's also issues which I found in terms of administrative fragmentation. This pops up over and over in all these issues. BMA's limited power, but all the number of agencies which work in all these different issues, and they don't work together often. They work almost like in kingdoms, partly to the budgetary bureaucratic system. So it makes collaboration different. There's also institutional inertia. And so these issues have popped up over and over again. But also the discourses which are used and to justify responses. And they're often used to actually prioritize the interests of the elite, and they marginalize the interests of the working class, for example. So these are, I guess, are a number of themes that have come up. But also, I think what I found is almost that there's almost been a stagnation, particularly in the last couple of decades. I mean, Thailand was moving forward in a lot of these environmental issues. There were improvements. But then, in the last, say, 15 years or so, or even longer, it's particularly stagnated. And I think I see this beyond environmental issues. You can see this in terms of poverty alleviation, transport. A lot of issues has been stagnation.
So that leads to maybe a concluding question. Through this dialogue series, we really hope to explore what the agendas of political ecology should be in the region. So in other words, thinking that research can actually help contribute towards making a difference and have transformative, positive change. So for a final question, I'd like to ask you if you were able to suggest what a political ecology research agenda should be, what would be some of the key directions that you would suggest?
Okay, sure. So I mean, from what I've talked about and what I've written a lot about these environmental problems and talk about how the political ecology framework is useful to examining, understanding them, and why it's been difficult to address, and why certain groups suffer more than other groups. But it's quite depressing. So I think for a way going forward, I mean, a key priority would be also discussing triumphs. I mean, either at the national scale, but also at the subnational scale. So for at the provincial, urban, or even community scale. I mean, how have communities or cities been able to successfully address these problems? And not just from a technocratic perspective, but from a political ecology or political economy perspective. So for example, when I did research on floods, the Yingluck government wanted to build this major floodway which would divert water from Bangkok and the Chao Phraya Basin to Samut Songkhram and Kon Pathom. But this would have a number of adverse environmental and social impacts on the groups, communities there. And what was quite inspiring is these groups were actually able to fight back. They organized a lot of protests, petitions, they sued the government successfully, and they were able to stop this floodway being built. So how was this able to happen? How do these social movement forms, what strategies they use? What political tools do they use? And so I think this would be quite useful in terms of moving forward, to think about also how we can address these problems. I mean, not only understand the problems, but also how to address them. And I think another broader issue would be as we reset and recover from COVID, hopefully, how will Southeast Asian countries move forward? I mean, the growth model here, as we talked about, has been very environmentally friendly, very unequal. How can it transition towards a more greener and more development process? Has it affected power relations? Are there openings for for groups to push towards this a newer model? So I think that would be another interesting angle to explore.
Great. Thank you so much for making time to join us today and for sharing your insights on flooding and haze. And hopefully we'll be able to invite you back again in the future and hear more updates on the work that you've been doing.
Well, thank you too for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.